Welcome back to our program, Jon Sweet and Mark Toth.
Hey, Daniel, thanks for having us back on the show.
Daniel, great to be here. Thank you.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy has urged Vladimir Putin to do an unconditional ceasefire in a personal letter for Russian dictator. This letter has been sent through diplomatic channels, according to Ukraine's foreign ministry, and also this letter has been published online for a wider audience, if we can say so. Mark, what is your reading of this letter and this diplomatic move by President Zelenskyy?
I think Ukraine at this point in the war has never been in a stronger position. And President Zelenskyy is likely trying to do two things here. See if he can't convince the Russian president to indeed enter into some kind of serious peace talks. And if not that, at least talks that would get more prisoners of war exchanged. But I think his primary intent here is also to embarrass the Russian president as well. He's taking a victory lap. If you break down that letter that Zelenskyy sent to Putin, he's basically calling him out in every facet of the war that, in effect, it's a failure. Putin got the message. He called it rude, not helpful. He said there's no point in meeting. So it didn't go over well in Moscow, but I don't think that was really Zelenskyy's intent in sending that letter. I think it was just basically Zelenskyy flexing before the world, as he should, that Ukraine has achieved remarkable successes on the battlefield inside of Ukraine and deep inside of Russia. And he's taking a victory map, and he's reminding that victory is closer to Ukraine than it is closer to Moscow. So I wouldn't overread into this letter. I just think it's Zelenskyy flexing, and rightly so. I think the Ukrainians have a lot to be proud about right now as a people and as a country.
And Jon Sweet, let's discover and also cover this military affairs and situation on the ground, because many military experts say Ukraine turns the tide of this war. And right now, situation on the ground, both on the ground and in the air, is more positive for Ukraine, with long-range strikes inside Russia on St. Petersburg, Moscow, Russia's oil refineries, and with Russian offensive, which has been stopped by Ukrainian forces on the ground. What has changed, Jon Sweet?
What's changed is that Ukraine has the initiative. Look, the strategy that Ukraine now is using, the tactics that they are employing right now against Russia is fivefold. It's one is to hold the Donbass, not to yield any more terrain, deny Russia its financial support, the oil reserves, right? The money that comes in that supports the war, to attrit Russian forces further. These kill zones that you hear about, and raising the attrition rate up from 35,000 to 50,000 Russian soldiers a month. Then to isolate Crimea, and then once the Crimea Peninsula has been isolated, make it untenable, and then force Russia's hand to withdraw from Ukraine. So that's the strategy, and they're well on the way. Look, they're producing their own weapon systems. They're no longer asking permission from the West of whether they can fire at targets within Russia. They simply fire at targets at will. And Russian air defenses, as we saw last weekend in St. Petersburg, are ineffective. They cannot stop Ukrainian drones. And that gives Ukraine a lot of leverage, and something that, quite frankly, Russia isn't prepared to cede by going to the negotiation table.
Also, President Zelenskyy has warned Vladimir Putin that Ukraine nears the point when it would be possible for Ukraine to create its own ballistic missile and strike Russia's key Russian cities. How could this change the course of this conflict, Jon Sweet? And how can you assess the newest introduction to the fight, Ukraine's Flamingo missiles and other homemade, I would call so, cruise missiles? Also, General Syrsky, Commander-in-Chief of the Ukrainian Army, has recently said that creation and introduction of Ukraine's ballistic missile can change the game, because Ukraine could use this ballistic missile along with cruise missiles, drones, and that's how this would be really effective.
Exactly. Look, one weapon system doesn't make the war, but this certainly puts another arrow in the quiver, okay, for Ukraine. The ballistic missile adds an additional capability one in range, but also two in the ability to strike targets throughout the depth of Russia. At one time, the vast space of Russia afforded sanctuary and afforded Russia protection. Today, that space doesn't exist because, quite frankly, modern technology has closed in that space. Look, Ukraine may and likely will attack targets in and around the Moscow area, but what Ukraine has not done and what they demonstrate very effectively in St. Petersburg is target civilians. Okay, they're not going to hit residential neighborhoods. They're not going to strike hospitals and markets and churches and bomb shelters. They're going to go after legitimate military targets and governance targets of Russia. And this particular ballistic missile, when it's developed, and if not mistaken, they said by July, it could be developed and fielded, is going to add them additional capability, additional leverage, something else to make the Russian air defenses worry about. And as I said earlier, Russian air defenses are porous and everything's getting through.
Mark, let's get back to diplomatic battle. This fight. How did we get from Putin threatening strikes against so-called decision-making centers in Kyiv to President Zelenskyy proposing a direct meeting with him, and how realistic would be such a summit?
Yeah, no, Daniel, it's a great question. Putin has no interest in meeting with Zelenskyy. He's going to say that from time to time for domestic political reasons inside of Russia. But at the end of the day, I don't think there's any man on this earth that Putin fears more than Zelenskyy. He realizes that he's got the upper hand on him right now, and that Putin has boxed himself into a corner. I think the reason this has changed, I think if you just go back to the beginning of this war and you look at what Ukraine's tactics were in the first days of defending Kiev, it was basically, shoot, scoot, and hide to take out those convoys with, using shoulder-fired rockets, man-pads to take down Russian helicopters, et cetera. And now you've got, in a multifaceted way, Ukraine taking the deep fight to Russia, taking creating the kill zones of drones, et cetera, on the front lines in the Donbass, and increasingly in the south towards, Kherson. All of that has just dynamically changed the field, and it's changed Zelensky's negotiating hand. No longer is Ukraine this one, facet of military capability that it was in the beginning of the war, miraculous as it was, and as key as it was to the country's survival. Now it's becoming multifaceted, and if you add those ballistic missiles to it, Zelensky's negotiating hand just gets stronger. So I think that's why you're seeing this diplomatic push. And basically, the ballistic missiles is messaging back to Russia, hey, be careful what you claim that you're going to do in Kiev, because we're developing the capabilities to do the same thing to you in the Kremlin. Do you really want to see the Kremlin in flames? I think Putin will say not.
Let's also cover a most recent story by Financial Times. Russian billionaire and former owner of the Chelsea football club, Roman Abramovich, met with President Zelenskyy in May. They discussed the possibility of ending the war in Ukraine. Zelenskyy conveyed a message to Putin throughout the Abramovich about personal meeting. What is your take on such behind closed doors contacts between Ukraine and Russia going on, and how could this relate to U.S. withdrawal from negotiations?
Yeah, I'll give you my quick reaction and flip it to John. I think at this point, the real messaging that's coming through from Zelenskyy is the 13-some-hundred, long-range deep strikes that Ukraine has already fired into Russia this year. That's the real messaging. I think, again, and it's just good politics, it's good domestic and global messaging where Zelenskyy is making sure that he's seen as a peacemaker, the would-be peacemaker. And that's why you're seeing these different kind of outreaches, the open letter, this letter through the former owner of the Chelsea football club in the UK, et cetera. But again, I think all of it is just kind of design theater. I just don't see Putin reacting to it. But it's important theater, don't get me wrong, for Zelenskyy to be doing, because it shows Ukraine in a position of strength. John may understand better the military implications of that on the battlefield. John?
Yeah, look, the outcome of those discussions, quite frankly, was negative. Putin's messenger brought forth yet again, just in different terms and through a different voice, maximalist demands upon Ukraine, in which Zelenskyy turned and said, no, we're not going to give it to Donbass, and that's not going to happen. until, and not until, we won't give up the Donbass. We will agree to a ceasefire, and we will agree to discuss other items. But Zelenskyy was an emphatic no, and that was the message that was sent back to Russia. Zelenskyy is in a seat of control, really, to be honest with you. He has leverage. He understands he has leverage, and he has capability. He also understands that Putin does not. Putin's trying to reach out to other means, but quite frankly, as long as the demands are maximalist, the answer is always going to be no.
Mark, and let's cover also diplomatic meetings this week. Recently, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy has met with British Prime Minister Keir Starmer, French President Emmanuel Macron, and German Chancellor Friedrich Merz in London. Leaders have urged Putin to accept a ceasefire along the current front lines and have demonstrated their willingness to engage in direct negotiations with Russia. What is your assessment of this diplomatic game going on in London and elsewhere in Europe?
Daniel, I think it's just a continuation of the same overall push that Zelenskyy is trying to make it clear that he's trying to be the peacemaker here. There's some inadvertent messaging going on to Trump as well, that, look, I'm trying to get this settled, but it's the Russians who are being obstinate, and they're the ones who are refusing to come to the peace table in good faith. And so I think this is just one more step. My only caution would be is that, look, Keir Starmer, Emmanuel Macron, even Friedrich Merz, disappointingly, based on his pre-election sloganeering and comments with respect to Ukraine, had been slow to actually get into this fight on a more kinetic kind of basis. A no-fly zone would be great. They continue to try to schedule meetings, to have more meetings, to potentially talk about the prospects of peace. But these meetings never go anywhere. And so to me, they just become photo ops that are frustrating because while in real time, and I'm not blaming Zelenskyy, he has to do this, he has to continue that outreach to continue Europe's support of Ukraine. You've got real Ukrainian soldiers that are dying, on the battlefields, putting their lives at risk. Ukrainian civilians that are getting hit by Russian missiles and drones. All of that's happening simultaneous to that, and Europe just seems stuck. They don't seem to figure out how to move forward. And look, I mean, we can all want peace. We can all aspire to achieve peace. We can all keep saying it's important to talk to Putin about peace, but he's not interested in peace. So it's kind of, a vanity project on behalf of the European leaders. I don't mean Zelenskyy, but Merz, Starmer, and Macron, to think that somehow they're going to convince Putin to come into some kind of peace deal. It's just not going to happen. The best piece is, to get to peace, the best offense is offense. And Ukraine has proven that. NATO needs to get on board, or especially the European countries of NATO.
And Colonel Sweet, what is your assessment of current level of European support for Ukraine? Is this enough?
Right now it is, and it has been. Support, right? Support, meaning weapons and that they're purchasing through the United States to get to Ukraine, also mean humanitarian assistance, monies, the abilities, if you will, for Ukraine to set up production facilities in European cities, like the Firepoint company, and making drones and missiles outside of the country for use inside the country. So on that level, support is well. But I'll go back to what Mark just said. What they haven't provided is the support that Ukraine desperately needs right now. That's an integrated air defense system, and that's some type of air no-fly zone. They are just completely unwilling to put European lives between Russia and Ukraine. And that's what's truly needed to help Ukraine defend themselves. Integrated air defense, not just piecemealing weapon systems and throwing munitions at them, but rather putting something together that can actually stop the massive drone, ballistic missile and glide bomb attacks. And that would help out Ukraine immensely.
You just mentioned about glide bomb, but Ukraine is also developing its own glide bomb as well as ballistic missile. How could this change the game on the battlefield?
Again, another weapon system that they can use, that they can employ. Most importantly, though, that's that weapon system that you can use in the mid-range. And there's a discussion of close, deep, and mid. Mid primarily being along those logistical hubs along the land bridge that connects Russia to Ukraine, and Ukraine obviously to Crimea, using those to destroy headquarters and fuel points and assembly areas. It's a great weapon system. Obviously, we've seen it on both sides, but another weapon that could be used. A single weapon is not going to do it, but the combination of all those weapons used together, that's going to make the difference. And right now, again, Russia can't stop it.
And also there is a rationing of gasoline in Crimea right now due to Ukraine's so-called middle strikes on this land bridge from Russia through the occupied territory to occupied Crimea. What's your take on this?
And my take is this: interdiction works. Okay, not just in the flow of troops and munitions, but everything. Like you just said, food, water, gasoline. It affects the military, but it also affects the civilian personnel that reside, if you will, in that area. The Russian civilians that are in Crimea, it affects them, it affects morale. But what we just saw earlier in this week is the Kandahar Bridge was destroyed, or at least severely damaged, and that's the bridge connecting Ukraine to the Crimean Peninsula. We've also seen Russian troops now withdrawn from the Kinberg Peninsula. Those troops were in a position to directly threaten Odessa, and they moved because they cannot logistically sustain themselves. Their supply lines are being struck as deep as 150 kilometers behind the front lines. That's a problem. Okay, and what's going to happen is that they are running out of gas and food, and they will either withdraw or surrender. So Ukraine is getting very close, closing, if you will, the loop to completely isolating Crimea. And when that happens, the fait accompli, that's going to bring Russian influence in Ukraine to zero.
And Mark, does this put additional pressure on Vladimir Putin? How could this play out?
It does, Daniel. Look, the loss of Crimea, or the effective loss of Crimea, would be a huge political blow to Putin domestically. I'm not sure he can survive that, the kind of pace. It may not be immediate, but it would cause a downward spiral with him. And I do think this is the big story. I mean, look, Ukraine has put itself in a position where now it's created a stranglehold on this land bridge connecting the Crimea Peninsula to the Russian mainland, and it's a question of whether or not Europe is going to stand beside them, support them more, give them the munitions, etc., so that they can take advantage of this. Look, Ukraine has created an amazing opportunity here, but it's going to take European support, ideally U.S. support as well. Sadly, we just know that's not going to be coming from the Trump administration. But this is something for the taking. Credit General Hodges, a mutual friend of all of us, for saying early on that Crimea was a decisive terrain. Amazingly, against all odds now, 4+ years into this, Ukraine is now potentially making that possible. But it's going to need, Brussels to be stepping up to the plate, the United Kingdom as well, and saying, look, here's this golden opportunity. And that, if they truly want to negotiate a peace deal with Putin, that would give them the leverage. If only Europe just has the guts to step in and say, hey, we are at the point where Ukraine is getting close to turning Crimea finally into this decisive terrain. To me, that's the biggest story coming out of all of this. And it's only been because of Ukrainian initiative and how they've taken the deep fight and then this intermediate fight, the 150 kilometers that John just spoke about, on the front lines in the Donbass, Kherson, and then, this land bridge has put Ukraine in this position. Europe, wake up and take advantage of this. It's a golden opportunity.
And Mark, does Ukraine still matters for U.S. administration? Because President Volodymyr Zelenskyy says that U.S. has shifted its focus on Iran war, and right now President Trump seems to be trapped in this situation with escalation in the region. What's your take on this?
Daniel, that's $1 million question because, sadly, it doesn't seem that Ukraine remains a high priority for the Trump administration. You do see officials trying to take victory laps in small ways. Through the Pearl system, they're still getting more armaments, intel sharing, et cetera, than they had under the Biden administration. But there's no overall administration push to create victory on the battlefields in Ukraine by doing more than just the minimum. So from that standpoint, it's disappointing. I'd like, if you don't mind, for me to answer this question in a different way. I I would argue, though, Ukraine is incredibly important to the United States as a whole and to its national security. And a mutual friend of John and mine, Representative Don Bacon, a former brigadier general in the United States Air Force, who was a wing commander in Ramstein, just led a fight in the House to get a discharge position, which meant the House leadership, congressional leadership of the Republicans, wasn't willing to bring a bill to the floor, but they got it through anyway, and it would pass. Now, Trump isn't going to support it, but it did call for upwards of $1.3 billion in aid. So I think that's critically important, and it is I can't underestimate to Americans and to Ukrainians just how important Ukraine is to the U.S.'s security. And look, as John wrote for us in the Washington Star, in Belarus, you see even Lukashenko changing his calculus of saying, I don't know if I want to get as involved in Ukraine as Putin was trying to convince him to do just a month ago. I mean, so very vital, because if you can push back that alliance, that helps U.S. forces as part of NATO defend even Europe even better against Moscow. So unfortunately, even though Trump doesn't get it, I think the United States as a whole does. And then hopefully Trump will wake up to that reality too, that Ukraine, in my opinion, is the best thing that ever happened to the United States in Eastern Europe. An incredible ally, even if the U.S. has let them down.
Thank you, Jon Sweet and Mark Toth, for your time and great insights today, and glory to Ukraine.
Thank you, Daniel.
Thank you, Daniel.